Actually, I'm going to talk also about Strawson and about John's reply, the same first John's argument against Strawson. I have written my paper this night, so it's not, I guess, not very good. I call it naturalizing Strawson's arguments. Peter Strawson considered moral philosophy as a philosophical area which, important as I recognize it to be, I have never found as intellectually gripping as those to which I have given more attention. Hence, Strawson's views on morality are effectively embodied, this is a quotation, in two articles. The first paper, Freedom and Resentment, has become very influential, while the second, Social Morality and Individual Ideal, is unreasonably neglected by many scholars. Strawson's view has been criticized from various positions. My aim is to show that some critique may be refuted if the second article is engaged. Let me start with social morality. Second, Strawson's article is an attempt to naturalize morality, which is the sphere of the observance of rules, such that the existence of some such set of rules is a condition of the existence of society. Strawson calls this definition a minimal interpretation of morality, which is very crude but relevant. In the rest of the article he makes it more precise, but he never denies this minimal interpretation. A society is composed of agents who are in various relations to each other. Some of them are moral relations, which do give cohesiveness to a society. This is again a quotation from Social Morality. Strawson writes, "The fundamental idea is that of a social sanctioned demand made on an individual in virtue merely of his membership of the society in question, or in virtue of a particular position which he occupies within it, or a particular relation in which he stands to other members of it. This notion of a socially sanctioned demand, as far as I understand, is closely related to the notion of reactive attitudes. Strawson doesn't tie them explicitly, but in the context of Strawson's philosophy, reactive attitudes seem to be the realizers of these demands." This is an incomplete picture of Strawson's position in the second article, but it's enough for the moment. Now let us consider freedom and resentment and its argument for compatibilism. Paul Russell, in his paper Strawson's Way of Naturalizing Responsibility, pithily notes that there are actually two lines of argumentation in Strawson. One he calls rationalistic, another naturalistic. The rationalistic argument relies on the distinction between two types of excuses, which Sophia has already mentioned. Russell writes, "Strawson maintains that nothing about the thesis of determinism implies that we always act accidentally, or in ignorance, or without forethought. Nor does the thesis suggest that we are all somehow rendered psychologically abnormal or morally undeveloped. In short, considerations of determinism, however they are interpreted, don't as such provide us with any reason to modify or suspend our reactive attitudes. The ground on which we do suspend or alter our reactive attitudes are of wholly distinct and independent nature. We have accordingly no reason whatsoever to suspend or abandon our reactive attitudes entirely, even if the thesis of determinism is true. This is the essence of Strawson's rationalistic reply to the pessimists." End of quotation. To describe the naturalistic line, I again use quotation from Russell. "The heart of the naturalistic strategy is the claim that it's psychologically impossible to suspend or abandon our reactive attitudes entirely." Paul Snowden, in his foreword to a collection of Strawson's essay, puts this distinction in slightly different words. Strawson is stressing two things. First, that there is no rational dependence of our responses on the falsity of determinism. Second, that in recognizing our moral attitudes for what they are and our practice as expressive of them, we avoid treating our practice of holding responsible as simply instruments of control, justified by their efficiency. It is easy to see the relation between the naturalistic argument and the ideas in social morality. In his interpretation, Russell stops at the notion of psychological impossibility, which is obscure. Why cannot we overcome this psychological embarrassment? Snowden says only that our practices are not only instruments of control, but what are they? In the light of social morality, the psychological impossibility appears to be social impossibility. To give up reactive attitudes means to refuse the social demand, which do give cohesiveness to a society. For a naturally social human being, it's altogether impossible. Hence, this psychological impossibility is an indication of an impossibility to give up the social way of life. Our moral practices not only require the social life, they make it possible. They not only regulate the social life, they make it possible. The rationalistic argument is not easy to reinterpret, though, in a naturalistic way. I'd like to start with answering one of John Fisher's objections to this argument. John attracts our attention to the first group of the excuses. Strawson points out that, it's a quotation from John, Strawson points out that sometimes we withhold the reactive attitudes in a particular context in which it's possible that an agent couldn't help it, is pushed, had to do the relevant action, and the action was the only way. This sort of formulation naturally suggests that in general, when an agent can't do otherwise, it is inappropriate to hold him morally responsible for the relevant behavior. But this lands one squarely in the traditional metaphysical debates about the relationship between causal determinism and could have done otherwise, and also the relationship between could have done otherwise and moral responsibility. To answer this objection, I'd like to mark that Strawson and John use different methods and come to different conclusions. According to the spirit of his epoch, Strawson uses ordinary language analysis. He talks about the sorts of special considerations which might be expected to modify or mollify our reactive attitudes. So this is from Freedom and Resentment. Respectively, John uses situations instead of considerations. His method is more objective. I will not criticize it. It's not language analysis. In section 3.2, John considers an alternative interpretation of Strawson, suggested by Justin Coates and Zachary Bachman. On this approach, this is quotation, the items on the list are not properly conceptualized as all pointing to or indicating in slightly different ways that the relevant agent lacks the free will possibility to do otherwise, a possibility that must be present in order for the agent to be morally responsible for the behavior in question. On the alternative interpretation, the presence or absence of such possibility is not in question, but thus the items on the list should be tied together in a different way. I think that it is the right way to interpret Strawson. This is what the language of Strawson's article suggests. All the considerations of the first group mean the agent has no alternative possibilities. That's true. But it doesn't imply that in fact there are no alternative possibilities. This point, based on ordinary language analysis, is disputable, and John doesn't hesitate to dispute it. I can accept that our actual practices of offering such pleas as he had to do it, and there was just one way, involve believing either explicitly or implicitly that the relevant agent lacks the free will possibility to do otherwise. This is a quotation from John's article. However, it is possible to show that it is irrelevant for our practices if the agent had the possibility to do otherwise. I have an example. Consider a firefighter who enters a burning house to save a person. At one point, he stops and faces two alternatives. Either he jeopardizes his life and tries to save the person, or he goes back not saving the person. If he goes back, he seems to be morally responsible for the person's death. But the first type of excuse is applicable to this case. We would say that the fighter could not do otherwise, although he had two alternative possibilities. And he recognized that he has them. We often have this kind of heroic alternative, but we are not really demanded to choose them. Granted that the rationalistic argument is valid, at least in this respect, it may be reinterpreted. As in the case with the naturalistic argument, Russell stops in halfway, and whom I'm quoted from, and Snowden also stops in halfway. The grounds on which we do suspend or alter our reactive attitudes are of wholly distinct and independent nature. We have accordingly no reason whatsoever to suspend or abandon our reactive attitudes entirely, even if the thesis of determinism is true. What is this independent nature? The question is. Strawson's argumentation may be tracked further, I guess. He divides all possible excuses in two groups. The first type is applicable to agents, to genuine agents, and the second type to non-agents. They are not absolutely non-agents. Children and schizophrenics, they are not genuine agents in the fullest sense of this word. In the second case, the person may lack the required agent features temporarily or permanently. Strawson draws our attention to the fact that it matters if a person is an agent or not. The consideration she could not do otherwise considerably differs from the consideration she is a child. In the first case, the person is an agent. The pessimist suggests that the considerations of the first group, he could not do otherwise, always work. But according to Strawson, then there will be no difference between agents and non-agents, which is the very basis of sociality. Human beings are unavoidably social, hence destruction of the border between agents and non-agents is impossible for them. According to this interpretation, the rationalistic strategy derives its force from Strawson's naturalism. And I would suggest that, in fact, Strawson has only one naturalistic line of argumentation. Strawson's article "Social Morality" gives us a hint how we can understand psychopathic wrongdoings according to his theory. Strawson says, "Everyone on whom some form of socially sanctioned demand is made has an interest in the existence of some system of socially sanctioned demands. I suggest that it means to be a member of moral community is to be interested in the existence of this community. Then moral understanding is not required for a person to be a member of a moral community." That's an attempt to reply Watson's argumentation against Strawson. In this sense, psychopaths, children and other groups are a part of the moral community, although they have more reasons to be excused. In Peribum's book, Strawson is one of the targets of criticism. Although Strawson's arguments are vulnerable for Peribum's four-case argument, in one respect Strawson is an ally of Peribum. He is not a basic desert compatibilist. Strawson writes, "A man should perform the duties of his situation in his society. This allows for an indefinite variety of societies and of stations within them. Hence Strawson's argumentation rules out moral responsibility in the basic desert sense. Naturalized Rosen's view is more complete, I guess, and stable than non-naturalized, but it's still open to critique from this position of manipulative arguments. For example, John uses this, it is his second argument, and Perry Boom's four stages argument. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Can you just, I just wanted a clarification of the firefighter case. Could you go through that again? Like, what was it supposed to show?
It's supposed to show that when we consider a person, when we apply this consideration that the person couldn't do otherwise, we don't always mean that there were no alternative possibilities. So the firefighter in a burning house has two real possibilities, and he considers them. Either he goes back, or he goes further to jeopardizing his life. But he decides to go back, and he says to the people who are standing there in front of the house that I couldn't. I have no choice, and they say, okay, yeah, that's true.
And coercion cases are sometimes like that. It's sort of, I hold a gun to your head and say, give me your money, or do something wrong. And you, in a way, have alternatives, right? You can just see if I'm going to shoot you or not, but that's unreasonable to expect of you. So you say, I had no choice.
John uses this term reasonable. I think that in this fire case, fireman case, both opportunities are quite reasonable. So. Don't you think so?
Right, well, okay, sure. I mean, if he had done it, if he had gone to save the person, he would be praiseworthy, and you could see why he might have had reason to do that. But it wouldn't be reasonable to expect or demand that of him, right? What do you think it would be?
Well, look, that's a very special. Why I chose the firefighter? Because they are expected to save people.
Yeah. So maybe you think he.
There are special. There are doctors. There are firefighters which are expected to do heroic, to show heroism, but they are not demanded to do this.
Yeah. Okay. But I think that our sense of whether or not that demand was appropriate is going to affect our willingness to accept the excuse, I had no choice. So I think that if we say, you're right, you had no choice, then we're going to think, well, it wouldn't be correct of me to demand that you take that up.
If we demand to every firefighter to jeopardize his or her life, we will have no firefighters.
Sure.
But I agree that there is something problematic about the firefighter case, because, I mean, it seems okay for him to say that it seems okay for the firefighter to say that, if I had gone back to save that person, that would have been at a great risk to myself. I need to live to save lives another day or something. I mean, there are lots of reasonable things that a firefighter can say. But because it is a firefighter who is expected to save people, for that very reason, I think it sounds false if he says that he couldn't have done otherwise. I think it sounds completely true if it was an ordinary citizen in that situation who said I couldn't do otherwise, but it just sounds false to me in the mouth of the firefighter.
No, I don't agree with this. They are not demanded to save all people. They are not demanded to.
Yeah, and that he could point out. But if he says that I couldn't have done otherwise, that sounds false to me.
Well, I don't think so.
Well, maybe there are different. First of all, I think it might be helpful to distinguish different cases. I mean, there's one where the house is engulfed in flames, and it's almost completely burnt down, and the person can't be saved without, there's a tiny chance that the firefighter could save the person and a great chance that he'll lose his life. But then there are other cases where there's a fire and that maybe there's a 50-50 chance he can save, and So then I think it might be important to distinguish different cases, but
Yeah,
in
I
general,
agree with that.
abstractly too, isn't this is just the difference between Jones 3 and Jones 4 in Frankfurt's examples like Jones 3. It would be unreasonable to expect him to, not comply with the threat, but literally Frankfurt says there's a sense in which he could. So that's why we're going to switch to Jones 4. But what I wanted to know also is what you think the significance of this. Do you think, someone might say, okay, the firefighter cases like bank teller cases or like Jones 3 in Frankfurt's 1969 paper, that just, and it's not really clear that you have in that case moral responsibility or blameworthiness and no freedom to do otherwise. But there are other cases where you would. What are you taking the significance of it to be?
I take the significance that when we say the person could not do otherwise, it's irrelevant if they really were.
So you think of it as friendly to the Frankfurt, or you think alternative possibilities are irrelevant to responsibility?
For the sake of Strawson's argument. No, I don't consider Frankfurt's argument. I want to say that when Strawson says we consider a person as he or she could not do otherwise, and he said he doesn't mention this alternative possibility, principle of alternative possibilities, and I want to prove that he's right not mentioning it.
Okay, so is this the idea that when he talks about, this is like Sophia's point that she thinks it's obvious that when he offers that list of excuses, he's talking about could have done otherwise in a compatibilist way, or is that what you're saying?
No, I think that what we, as far as I understand, when we're talking about compatibilists, they're concerned about the situations. Yeah. And Strawson is not concerned about the real facts. He's concerned about considerations. And I want to prove that he is able to avoid failing into compatibility.
Interesting. Well, that seemed to be an important point for you, that you distinguished situations from considerations. And you think I'm concerned with situations and Strawson's concerned with considerations. But can you say more about that, or can you elaborate? Okay.
I said just Strawson, in the spirit of his epoch, he used this ordinary language analysis, which he used more objective methods.
But do you think there's something important that hangs on that, or you think they're just different ways of getting at the same?
I think that Strawson's argument is valid only if we accept his method. But I'm not sure if, like, when he in his second article, he doesn't accept this method. He's rather realistic, and I'm not sure if we follow him. The argument will be stable.
So about the second article, the social morality and individual ideal. How many people have read that?
I've read it, but
I've seen it cited a couple times.
it's been a long time, though. This is
I think it is true that people should pay attention to it. Or at least I've seen a couple people cite it and say people need to pay attention to it. It's actually really important, but it's surprising that most people haven't read it or even heard it. So, one idea you're summarizing there was that everyone who has demands placed on them by society, culture, has an interest in...
Yeah, that's what...
Has an interest in what?
In society. And because it's a vital interest.
Okay.
So you just can't live without society.
Does it go the other way, that if you have an interest in society, then you can have demands placed on you?
Yeah, that's like equal. Yeah.
Then the claim about the psychopaths would follow.
Watson he has these lists after his paper, and he said that they are generally parasitic psychopaths, and they definitely have interest in a society. They can't live without society, although they don't have moral understanding. And I think that Watson, he's right that according to Strawson, to be morally responsible, you must be a member of moral community. But he is wrong to understand what a moral community is. You must not allow yourself, say that I am a member of this community. It's enough to say that, enough to use the community.
Yeah,
that's what Strawson said. I guess.
I think that's a valuable point for me, actually, from my perspective.
And there is a quotation from the second article of Strawson.
Yeah. So you talk about what would a non-naturalized version of Strawson's view be like?
Well, that's what I quoted from Russell and Snowden. So we say we distinguish these two lines of argument. The first is rationalistic. This the classification argument, and we stop at the point where Strawson says, "Look, there is the full classification of excuses, and there is no determinism among these excuses." And this is a non-naturalized version of this first argument. And if naturalized, it would say that it's impossible to put determinism in both groups.
Of excuses?
Of excuses, because it will make no difference between agents and non-agents, and that's impossible.
Right, you said something like it's not possible for us to not be agents, or...
No, I mean that we cannot, when we try to apply, when we consider if we apply or not apply the moral attitudes, first we consider if a person is an agent or it's not an agent, she is not an agent. And if determinism is true in the pessimistic sense, then it doesn't matter if we face an agent or not agents. And this is very harmful for the very existence of society. And pessimist wants this to be a truth. And the second line of argument, which Russell calls naturalistic, it's the point that it's psychologically impossible to abandon, to give up these attitudes, these reactive attitudes. And I want to say that it's not, so psychological impossibility is a bit weird. We can say that, but you can overcome this impossibility.
So it would be so the claim was psychologically impossible for us to give up the attitudes, which means psychologically impossible for us not to view others as agents.
Yeah, and this has this basement of all this social stuff. Like it's not only psychological impossible,
socially
but it's social and vitally.
Impossible to have society unless you view other people as agents.
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, that's how what I suggest.
Yeah, I think that's good.
So?
I had a thought about, you said that maybe Strawson and Pereboom are sort of allies.
Because Strawson's not a basic desert compatibilist. I was thinking that maybe there might not be entirely allies because Strawson wants to maintain resentment, whereas Pereboom wants to get rid of resentment. So maybe like they're not. Yeah. Maybe they're allies in some respects, but they want to maintain some attitudes.
They're not like real allies. I don't want to say that they prove one and the same point. But Pereboom misses. He tries to shoot a wrong target. He in his, as far as I understand, his fourth chapter, he lists Strawson against among these basic desert compatibilists. And Strawson is not a really basic desert compatibilist, as far as I understand him.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he doesn't ever use the term, as I recall. Well, he may have used it, but he doesn't. As we mentioned before, he talks about targeting oneself and others with the reactive attitudes. He doesn't even typically say one has to be an apt or appropriate target, and he certainly doesn't say one has to deserve the reactive attitudes. It's just that that's what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like to think implicit is some idea that certain individuals are apt targets in virtue of showing the relevant kind of will, quality of will. Mm-hmm. But you're right, he's not a basic desert compatibilist. But Ben is also right that they certainly would part company because Paraboom does not want to have indignation and resentment. Strawson thinks they're essential. They're the glue that hold us together. Okay. But they're allies in the same way that the UK and the US and Russia were allies in the Second World War. We all wanted to defeat the Nazis, but then we had different further agendas. But okay. Other comments? Or?
Okay.
Oh, about the firefighter, I guess what you might say, well, depending. I mean, you could say he's morally responsible for the consequence that the person dies, but not blameworthy. And that would be what some people would be inclined to say. I think John would probably take that route. You know, if he did have access to bringing about the saving of the person, so he had guidance control of it, so he's morally responsible, but he's not blameworthy.
That might be true, but for the sake of Strawson's argument, we should not distinguish blameworthy and not moral responsibility as he does. Doesn't think so.
Well, I mean, he doesn't. He doesn't. You're right. It seems natural that you could kind of push that on him, but he doesn't do that. So.
How would you characterize your main point? Like, do you want to defend a Strawsonian conception, or I got lost as to what your bottom line or the main. If you had to just boil it down into a couple sentences, what would you say?
Well, I want to defend the Strawson's view. Not my idea is that what, for example, Watson calls the Strawsonian view
It's not.
It's Strawson's view, because if we add the second article to freedom and resentment, and we can ground Strawson's argument in this social basement of morality.
Maybe that's the highlight in that you think we shouldn't just. People have evaluated freedom and resentment just on its own, but you think it's important to.
Yeah, I think it's important to
take into account the other article, and when you do, you can get this social dimension, and then you could reply to my critiques. Is that part of it, or is that part of the view that somehow my critique didn't take into account the
well, no, my reply to your critique is slightly different. I stress the point that the methods are different.
Oh, okay.
It's a bit.
So that's the different focus on considerations versus situations.
Yeah,
I'd have to think more about that.
I think that the second article is important just because Strawson says, I have written only 2 articles on moral philosophy, and all what I wanted to say is embodied in these 2 articles. So it's not like a random article, it's intentionally 2 intentional articles.
That is also an interesting difference between Strawson and all the other people we've been reading and talking about, and who typically are talked about. You think of Peter Van Inwagen, he's written many articles and books, and Harry Frankfurt and Gary Watson and so forth. But Peter Strawson really wrote those just 2 articles, that he's had this incredible influence, and 99% of the influence comes from the 1 article. So that's an important article, certainly. Okay. Thank you. I think, yeah.